Awesome. Okay. There we go. Fantastic. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here on the second ever Scientia branded webinar. I guess we're sophomores now. We're getting our awkward legs underneath us as screen sharing goes there. Thank you so much for joining us on this next step in our journey to replace anecdotes with real data-driven information. For those of you who don't know me, I'm David Seversky. I'm joined here by John Sturgis.
Hi, everybody.
Good morning, John. Together, John and I worked on the tsunami report along with the rest of the crew at Scientia. We're really happy to be sharing and speaking with you today. Some of you may have been expecting costumes. I'm sorry to disappoint. The Cthulhu mask that I had was inspiring actual madness. So, you know, HR said no. We do have a few spooky treats still included here. So we hope that you've seen this. For those of you that have not come across the IRIS series before and may be a little intimidated, don't be. We're going to give you enough of a primer here to understand everything that we're talking about. If you have come from IRIS, stay tuned. We've got lots of new information to share with you on the tsunami concept and following the wake of damage from major multi-party cyber incidents. So new or old, we've got you covered. Our objective today is to walk you through some of the key findings and have a good focus on what this means for risk managers. It's not a substitute for reading the report. We hope you still check out the report. We love it. Please help us. But we do want to give you some of the highlights on that. And also special thanks to our three sponsors for the Tsunami Report, Risk Recon, Interos, and CyberGX. We could not have done this without your generous support. So thank you very much for supporting the IRIS Tsunami Report. Thank you. Yay, much celebration. So with that, let's get started. A little bit of housekeeping. As you may have noticed, this session is being recorded for posterity and future playback. After this webinar, it will be posted up on our YouTube channel. Hey, by the way, did you know we have a YouTube channel? Isn't that amazing? If you go out to YouTube and search for Scientia or Scientia Institute, you'll find our YouTube channel there. Right now, you can find the previous webinar we did with the Extreme Report, and you will find a brand new start of our new series called Research Reels, tentative name for it right now, if I could say that name cleanly, which is meant to be a short segment on each of our new reports that come out, such as the IRIS Tsunami, that gives you just a little video teaser of what we're talking about, why it may be relevant to you, and help you focus your time, and since we're all so multi-threaded these days there. If you do like that, I do encourage you to do the social thing and click subscribe and like on those videos there. YouTube requires a certain number of subscribers before we can get all fancy with the customization and give you pretty URLs and so forth. So if you have a moment, go out and subscribe to us on YouTube there, and that'll help us get to that magic number there so we can give you a nice clean look and feel on all that. The slides that we're presenting today will be posted to the Scientia events page. If you go out to scientia.com/events, after the webinar, you'll find the slide deck here as well. So if there's some little tidbit that you missed there, please do so. But one of our big focuses for this conversation is to have a Q&A with the audience. There is a Q&A tab here on Zoom, which I think most of us are probably familiar with in this day and age there, left, right, depending upon the size you've got going on there. Please do submit your questions. John and I will be doing our best to triage those as they come in during the webinar, but the very worst case, we'll take some dedicated time at the end of this conversation to make sure that we are addressing all of your questions. Okay. Enough of that, let's get to the content. So what are we doing here today? Well, we've got four main topics. Our agenda to catch the waves of our spooky, I have the spider up there, our spooky waves is talk about what is the IRIS. IRIS as a concept has been growing and expanding as we get more analytical framework for addressing loss incidents. We'll talk about the shape of water, understanding what ripples are. We'll talk about the impact of tsunamis and what this means for networks of firms, whether that be supply chain or other business-to-business relationships. And then we'll wrap up with some lessons learned and coming attractions. So what is the Information Risk Insight Study, or IRIS? Well, for those of you that are not familiar with this is a series of reports that is specifically focused on information risk managers and analysts. Here at the Science Institute, we've been fortunate to partner with a number of fantastic firms such as Kenna, RiskRecon, Veracode, et cetera, many others there, and have done a lot of what we think is really great work on the control side of the equation. IRIS is a time for us to flip the script, if you will, and focus upon what happens when those controls fail. Look at event information and understand the frequency, probability, and loss magnitude of events. This is an area where there has been traditionally not a lot of hard data. Reports such as the Verizon DVR notwithstanding there's not a whole lot of information about what happens when controls fail, and from a data-driven risk management perspective. And here at Santa, we're big advocates of arming risk practitioners to replace the fear, uncertainty, and doubt with actual data, and to replace some of that uncalibrated guesswork with actual information. So what is the IRIS family? Well, IRIS as a family has grown. You may be familiar with our seminal report, the IRIS 2020, where we looked at what I kind of view as myself the house cat size breach, the typical event, where we replace some flawed assumptions around the static cost per record, which is a personal bugbear of ours, and look and say, what is actually a better estimate for loss? How can we actually understand what is the frequency and loss magnitude of events? That was very well received there. And we then understood as we were looking at those events that we were looking at many different types of events. There's the typical house cat, but there's also the big cat, if you will, the extreme events there, where we actually looked at the tail edge for those mega events and saying, what's happening in that? How is that different? But we didn't just look at particular events and do the same thing again with different events. We actually expanded our analytical framework. Within Extreme, we introduced this concept of patterns, where we're looking at ransomware versus data exposure versus system intrusion, et cetera, there. And this is a concept we've carried on today to look at the IRIS Tsunami event, which you can think of, if we did the house cat, we did the big cat, this may be the hair balls. Where I know, not very pleasant concept, but I think the metaphor works. It's all tangled up together. Where we're looking at extreme cases of loss magnitude by several different dimensions, which we'll talk about in just a moment, around what happens for multi-party breaches when more than one company is involved. How are these things different? Is there something different we can learn about these? And how can we manage this in the face of the hyper-connected world we're all in? All of these reports are available today out at scientia.com/iris. They're free for download, no registration required. We highly encourage you to go out and check them all out where you can find this and future work. Also, as a sneak peek, we're super excited to talk to you a little bit today about IRIS Risk Retina, which is our newest service offering. We've been under development on this for several months now. We're really excited to have this come to fruition there. We'll talk a little bit more afterwards there, where our concept is to deliver IRIS-powered analysis customized for your particular firm, empowering risk analysts to make decisions that they need with data that is relevant to them when they need it. Okay. That all be said, let's go into the fantasy horror element of our presentation, where we talk about just what is a tsunami. And this is more than just a clever metaphor. And hat tips to the Wade Baker there. All the good puns that we use in our IRIS reports are generally his. All the bad ones are probably mine or someone else's on the team there. We just can't match his content there. So tsunami as a concept started with reports that we did with and continue to do with RiskRecon. So this is all starting with a ripple. And what is a ripple? A ripple is an event that takes place at a single organization, but then the effects spread out to multiple firms. In the case of what we did with the first ripples report in 2020, I believe, maybe it was 2020 if I have that date correct on that. We define a ripple as any incident that involves 3 or more firms. So if it's just one firm and another firm there, we exclude it from our ripples analysis. We're really looking at when there are multiple firms involved, several firms involved. And we continued that work in the most recently released report last month of the Ripples V2 2021 edition, where we expanded this into the concept that we just talked about with Extreme, where we're looking at the patterns of activity. How are multi-party events different for ransomware versus data breaches, et cetera, there? And we also expanded this into the concept of duration, When you drop a pebble into the ocean and you have that event at a single firm, the generator, if you will, how long does it take for those effects to spread out through the ecosystem? That's the duration of ripples. And you'll see some of that in what we talked about in ripples, in tsunami, excuse me. So it's interesting, and one of the questions we get when we talk about ripples there is, are all of these supply chain events? And I think back to the idiom that all cats are gray. And what does that statement mean? That means that if you have the right dim lighting, all cats look pretty much the same shade. They're all kind of grayish in nature. And that is perhaps accurate. But as you add more information, more light to it, differences appear. You can see that tabby is clearly not a black cat. Maybe even it's a white cat there. And I think this is a useful metaphor when talking about ripples and as they grow up into the mega events that are tsunamis, where all supply chain events are ripples. So if you have a breach that takes place and affects the supply chain, if there are more than two companies, that is by nature a ripple event. But you cannot say that all ripples are supply chain events. So an example of an event that is a ripple or a tsunami that is not a supply chain event would be a data aggregator or software as a service custodian there, where you have multiple firms that maybe have their information stored at a single provider. That single provider has an event, and then all the data owners are impacted as a result of that data being compromised, even though those actual data generators, those data owners, didn't have their information directly breached. If you'd like a further conversation around what is the difference between supply chain and tsunami and ripple events there, take a look at the report where we go into this in more detail. So what makes a ripple a tsunami? In IRIS Extreme, we looked at the 2020 with 20 million records or more, or $20 million in losses and more. This is a little bit more complicated when you're dealing with ripples because of the multi-party nature there. So we wanted to look at the top 50 of these events and look, is there something unique about these? And so we looked at the ripple events we have over the population for the past 10 years, and we're looking to identify what is a threshold that we can use for these disastrous mega waves to actually do a deep dive into them. So we looked at three major dimensions. The first being financial losses, how much money was involved from a reportable perspective. Second being records affected, how many people generally were involved in each of these events. And the third being the number of firms involved, how many organizations were swept up by this. And that gave us a total of 50 events in one or more of these dimensions that we then used as the basis of the tsunami report. So we then took these 50 events and we did some additional research. So in the IRIS series, we start with the Advising Cyber Loss Feed, which is a comprehensive commercial data source of events going back decades there that we focus traditionally on a 10-year period there. But then we go beyond what's available in that feed and look at multiple different OS intelligence sources, such as SEC filings, news media, security research reports, on and on there. I have to mention here that none of what we do in IRIS Extreme and IRIS Tsunami would be possible without our crew of fantastic research assistants. I have to give a shout out to Claire, Noah, Natasha, Jason, Holly. Thank you all for all your efforts there. We could not have done this without you there. So with that team of research assistants, as well as the rest of us here at Scientia, we go out and we look for additional information using public data sources on multiple different things. I won't read all these to you there, but some of the key things to keep in mind is that we're trying to identify from our expertise as security professionals and data scientists, how do we understand a factor better? We look at the actors, the actions, the assets using VAERS framework. We're trying to match these to the MITRE ATT&CK framework, looking at litigation around that there. All of that becomes the real grist for RML when we talk about tsunami. So now that we understand a little bit about the concept of what these multi-party events and these ripples are and how they might be classified as a potential tsunami event, let's talk a little bit about the impact of these waves. And I just have to give a shout out to the oatmeal. I love this graphic there. It just makes me happy. I tried to advocate it for the cover, but commercial image, yada, yada. So if we look at these 50 tsunami events in an aggregate, we see some rather jaw-dropping numbers. From just 50 events, we see over $17.5 billion in losses, with over almost 3.5 billion records at risk, which involves traditionally, personal financial information, payment information, and personal information as well. And we see almost 3,500 companies impacted by this in one form or another. And that's a tremendous reach around that. If you had any doubts about the impact of ripples and tsunami, you can go back to this chart, which we displayed a couple times in the ripples report and makes a reoccurrence here in tsunami. We're talking about the difference in loss magnitude for single party events versus a ripple event. You can see here that this dark green area represents those events that take place within a single firm. The orange area represents those firms that are multi-party in nature. And those first green lines represents the typical measure of loss, where as a single party, you have like about an $84,000 loss, whereas a ripple event, $850,000 there. So these ripple events are 10 times the cost of a single party event. And typically, even though there are extremes in this case, a typical ripple, you're only looking between 3 and 7 companies involved there. So the loss magnitude does not scale linearly based upon the number of companies involved there. These ripples have much bigger impact. And when we're talking about the extreme case, the extreme value for a single event, about $17.5 million there. And for a ripple event, it's almost $400 million. That's 22 times the cost of a typical event when we're talking about the extreme. Truly, this is a very fat tail distribution, lots of things to explore on that. So if we return to our 3 measures of what a tsunami event is, that being financial losses, records, and organization size, we can see that a typical extreme event, if that isn't too much of an oxymoron, is over $90 million. Compared to a typical ripple of 854,000, that means that these extreme value cases are very different. That being said, there are a few that pull away into the multi-billion-dollar club. And that's a very rarefied audience, thankfully, in our data set there. And these include some names that you may be familiar with, Equifax, Facebook, Cambridge Analytica, et cetera there. Intellect Service may be a name that may not immediately jump out to you, but this is actually the source or generator firm that was compromised in the widespread NotPetya attacks. So NotPetya you probably have heard of there. That's actually the firm, the Ukrainian firm where this started out with that was impacted there. It's important to note that we also look at the costs that were incurred by the generator or the source of the firm versus the losses that were incurred by the downstream or recipients of those losses. Over 2/3 of the losses in our cases were felt by the generator here. So we're talking about very large events and very large outsized losses that were experienced by the source of the tsunami event. If we go on and look at records at risk, most of these are in the neighborhood of 7 million in size. Nearly 1 in 5, or about 20%, are over 100 million in size, which includes some mega events. Again, we have Facebook on here, but we also have the adult friend finder networks, Starwood Hotels, which includes Marriott, et cetera there. It's important to note here that this is a differently shaped distribution than our previous slide with financial records, and it's much more heavily tailed. That even though mega large losses are rather rare, mega large record losses in terms of individuals affected is much more common there. So we see that pretty frequently in our data set. And again, this is mostly personal information and payment account information that we see most commonly. Going on to organizational impact, how many firms are affected by this? Our median size for these tsunami events is about 31. It's actually relatively small, as you may think about there. But there are some events that are much larger. Blackbaud, 350 plus events. Global Payment Systems, nearly 700. Kaseya Systems, 800 events plus. And it's important to note that these events are continually updating. I think it was actually after we went to press, we saw some information up on right, John, on Blackbaud, which is, I think it's now over 400 events, if I remember correctly, something like that. So this continues to update. It's part of what we continue to maintain our data set internally there. But these events typically take years for them to be fully understood and what the impact is. So now that we understand size of these things, let's talk a little bit about the different varieties of tsunamis and how they affect you. I'm going to switch it over to John now.
Great, thank you. So now that David's kind of scared us straight about how big these can be, right, we're going to try and turn the lights on a little bit and get a feel for just the nature of propagation, what these look like to the generators of the events, as well as the recipients downstream of the events. And yeah, we'll go from there. So we're going to start with our patterns. And patterns are, if you're familiar with our work in the Extreme series, as David mentioned, or also in the DBIR, it's kind of like the scariest place I ever experienced, which is middle school, where a lot of people tend to sit together at the same tables. So we kind of see the same threat actions, to speak in Varus terms, that kind of clump together. So as we look at the overall patterns within the 50 tsunamis, we do see some similarities that we found in the Extreme data set. For example, system intrusion and ransomware lead the pack in terms of frequencies, which was the same case in Extreme. But we also start to see this interesting divergence in the kinds of risk scenarios and questions we could ask. So if we're going to ask, what's the most common way that these ripples have propagated throughout tsunamis, the question is absolutely through more traditional system intrusion style attacks. But if we want to ask ourselves what's likely to cost us the most, what's going to hurt the most, it's probably no surprise to many that ransomware is kind of the breakaway hit. They're both somewhat similar in terms of total downstream organizations affected, but the price tag associated with ransomware is nearly double that of system intrusion at 7.8 billion. So it's something that can't be ignored. But again, we need to keep in mind this split between most common and most costly, where here they aren't necessarily the same thing. And all this just comes down to, from a risk manager perspective, what are the scary stories we're telling ourselves and executives when we're talking about ripple events in general. Now, as we move from patterns, we're going to shift to strictly the generator perspective, or the central victim. I will note that the axes are much further out on this one because of just how prominent valid accounts were as far as initial access techniques. For reference, these come from the MITRE ATT&CK framework initial access techniques components. And here we see a big difference from the previous chart, where valid accounts are both the most common and the most expensive. Now, when we're thinking about how should our upstream partners be defending themselves against attacks in general, this isn't a big surprise. They should be doing what most organizations are trying to do, which is managing permissions and privileged accounts. And when we think about the second most common, you'll notice that exploiting public-facing apps just blows away valid accounts in terms of downstream affected downstream organizations. So what do we do with this? Well, if valid accounts are the most common in 19 out of 50 tsunamis, this is what we should focus on asking our current and potential partners about their security practices. So I don't know if you've ever been on the receiving end or the sending end of a very long security questionnaire when you're trying to establish a contract, but sometimes you can wonder which of these questions are worth asking. Well, we can tell you confidently, you definitely need to be probing their practices around account management and how privileged accounts are used within the organization and to access your organization as a partner. But you should also be asking about their practices on updating and managing their public-facing applications. So if those two are kind of cornerstones in your questionnaires or whatever process you have, you're covering a pretty big bulk of these extreme ripple events. So now that we've talked about the initial victim, or the the generator, let's shift focus to the receiver. So this part of the tsunami research is really exciting to me because the other stuff I think we've kind of talked about in other contexts, but this is the meat and potatoes of, okay, I have a business to business relationship with a partner. How are they likely to impact me via that relationship in a ripple event? So again, no surprise, we see a chart that has supply chain at the top finally, right? Talking about supply chain events. By far the most costly. These took up, let me see, I think it was, 7.4 billion in losses combined across just those things labeled supply chain compromise. Specifically, what we're talking about are supply or software supply chain events. So whether that's altering source code or manipulating the distribution mechanism for an upstream provider. Most notably, these are your SolarWinds and your Kaseya events. But again, we see this dichotomy of what costs the most versus what you're most likely to see, because aggregated data is the most common way that downstream partners are affected. So in 19 out of 50 tsunamis, the effect was propagated via just aggregated data, totaling a combined $2.3 billion. And from a risk management perspective, these are the ones that are scary to me. So if we think in terms of what we can do about the given attack types we're experiencing, you have some measure of control within your organization about software updates and the mechanisms that are used, the relationship with the company that's providing those in your software supply chain. But aggregated data is a bit of a different animal, because a lot of times, once the cat's out of the bag, your data is now stored or housed at your partner firm. It can be very difficult to get details on retention practices, what kinds of data segregation is in place, what kind of, whether it's encryption in place or something like that. So we have to change our mindset to be a lot more preemptive or preventative in the controls we consider as far as the propagation style of aggregated data. So what do we do with that information? Well, it helps us figure out of our portfolio of partners, which ones should we emphasize in the short term to evaluate their practices. We should focus on those with whom we share lots of our data, where we've delegated some responsibility. And we should focus on those that have, whether automated or non-manual mechanisms of updating software in our environment, our production environment. These would be the top two that I would focus on as a risk manager if I were trying to work out the implications of tsunamis for my organization. So now we're going to look at the actors behind these events, the culprits. And when we think about these, it's no surprise. We see external actors are the breakaway hits, or the number one with the bullet. So nearly 100% of these events were perpetrated by, nearly 100% of the organizations that were affected downstream were affected by events initiated by external actors, and more than 2/3 of the losses. Now, external actor versus internal, not quite as granular as we could get. So when we dig into the external layer, in the next chart, we see the breakout of state versus just criminal groups. So to me, this is a really interesting view of, again, what you're likely to see versus what's likely to hurt the most. So organized criminal groups, they end up, they're kind of your run-of-the-mill, day-to-day activities, crime as a business. And then the pain really happens, though, with these 1 in 5 events that were attributed to state-affiliated actors. In this case, 10.2 billion overall. But what's fascinating here is that in most cases, the downstream organizations weren't targeted themselves by state actors. So if you're thinking this am I going to be targeted by an organized criminal group versus targeted by a nation state actor? Those aren't the only two possibilities we need to consider. We also need to consider how might my partners be targeted by a nation state actor in a way that ends up impacting our organization. And adding at least that third consideration will put you ahead of the pack as far as describing your risk universe. The last little chunk we'll talk about here is just the implications of quote insider risk here. It's really important to note that in very few of these cases were insiders the actual the culprit of the event, but in nearly all of the losses, an insider played a role as an unwitting accomplice, whether as an insider, an employee of the organization, or as a third party. So it's clear that with losses like 17.3 billion, we can't ignore taking care of our employees, preparing them and protecting them, but not admonishing them necessarily, because we're not suspicious of what they're doing, but they are definitely being used as mechanisms to get into our organizations. The call is coming from inside the house in this case. It's just not your employee that's on the other end. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, David.
Thank you, John. So those are just a few highlights of what's in the report. And again, I encourage you to take a look at the IRIS Tsunami full report there at cyenta.com/iris if you haven't had a chance to take a look at it there. But let's talk a little bit more about what are some of the key takeaways. I think John did a great job of highlighting some of the elements about insiders being not necessarily the causal factor, but certainly key in that event. There's some other elements there that I think are really relevant for risk managers if you're trying to deal with extreme events or even just manage general risk, cyber risk for an organization. As sort of a punch list of things you may want to keep in mind, let's talk about the median cost of tsunamis, $90 million. That's a very large number, and it far outweighs the typical single party event at $84K. That's just huge. These multi-party events are non-linear in their scale, so that as you add more firms, your cost goes up, not just a factor of the number of firms, but exponentially, even geometrically in size there to get all fancy about it there. The losses get really, really large, really, really fast. Something that I was really struck by first in the extreme report and just amazed to see it continue here in Tsunami is nation state actors and organized crime continue to play a major role. As a former defender, I had always thought of APTs as kind of a boogeyman, that it was not something that I could practically defend against and was not something that was really in scope for my threat universe. I have to say the data has changed my opinion now, that we now have to be concerned about this. I mean, what a day and age that not just organized criminal, but actual nation states are a concern, not just for the military industrial complex, but for all of us out there. If you have data, they will come and find out about it. But that being said, it's really fascinating to me that they're not using esoteric techniques. Even these very advanced adversaries, even though they almost certainly do have very advanced capabilities, they're not really deploying it in what we see of the publicly discoverable events there. And I should have added a caveat that when we're talking about publicly discoverable, it's really hard to have a multi-billion-dollar loss and not have that information come out. I would say it's practically impossible. So we feel very confident that major losses there do result in coverage and actually do come into our data set eventually. So to get back to this point, these nation state actors, these organized criminals they've professionalized cybercrime. They are out, they have targets to meet, they're going to meet those targets there, but they're not going to work any harder than they necessarily have to. And that we saw that with most of the events being the result of valid accounts. So the existing baseline controls that we already have for account prevention, account monitoring, rotating credentials, et cetera, there were necessary or actually going to credentialless things such as MFA and so forth, zero trust being the buzzword there. These are actually very effective in preventing what we're seeing from even these very advanced actors. Does that mean that they could bring out some advanced zero-day? Certainly they could. But my theory, my hypothesis is that they will not deploy those techniques for most of the population. Let's save that for where they really have to get the job done. course, we can't really talk about breach information these days without having a conversation about ransomware, which John already did a great summary on there. Keep in mind that ransomware in the Tsunami data set is underrepresented based upon what we'd see for prevalence in terms of frequency. However, it's overrepresented for losses. So it is not very frequent, but it punches above its weight when we're talking about losses out there. I think ransomware is a fantastic topic. We'll have more to talk about that in future research as well. Stay tuned for that. And then again, that aggregate data and shared systems are the most common means of these tsunamis propagating out beyond the single firm that actually experienced the event. Supply chain attacks are certainly present, but it's actually data commingling outside of supply chain networks that we see as the major source of these things spreading out there. That may shake up the decisions a little bit. It's not just the direct business-to-business relationships you have with supply chain. You have to be aware of where is your information going? What are the services that are key for your organization to deliver value to your customers? And that is a complicated thing to take place in. My general recommendation on that is always to work very closely with your vendor management team, not just within IT, but outside of IT, because it's probable that they are sharing data as well outside the common confines of what's happening within IT, and look at that as well. So I want to focus for just a moment on the enterprise risk managers that may be in our audience here. If you like what you see in IRIS, and I hope that you do, but you struggle a bit about how do I apply this? What does this mean for me? How do I actually apply this to my risk management program? Well, by golly jingo, we have got something for you. We've got IRIS Risk Retina. IRIS Risk Retina is now a service that we are offering at Scientia that gives you IRIS style analysis, particular for your organization. It helps you answer the questions about what is the probability of an event in my sector? What is the likely loss magnitude for one of these events happening that's relevant to my organization? And we give you a range of estimation tools for whatever level of risk analysis you're trying to perform in your organization. If you're trying to use a high, medium, low, and just want to get something better for a single number of what the risk is, we can give you that. If you want to go to one-in tables, as you might have seen from IRIS 2020, or if you want to get really fancy stochastic Monte Carlo simulations and you want to plug this into your FAIR or other cyber risk quantification framework, oh yes, mustache twirling, John. If you want to get into that approach there, we will give you the actual distribution parameters as well as measures for goodness of fit. How good are these estimates there? And we'll give you something that we've seen very popular in the FAIR community is loss exceedance curves for these events. We have all this available to you, and we really want to put this in the hands of enterprise risk managers to go out and do a better job of risk management and focus less upon the data acquisition side and more about the risk analytics and deciding and acting side of risk management. But beyond just those dimensions, we have a whole bunch of areas there. I mentioned ransomware. We have the ability to provide a ransomware-focused report that actually helps you understand what is the real clear and present danger that may be present in ransomware, or is it all just smoke and mirrors? Extreme events, as we've talked about here in Tsunami and IRIS Extreme are present as well, as is multi-party events, this Ripple concept. And we have much more. Sectors and subsectors, organization size, extreme risk. We're really excited about various and attack mappings. We've done a lot of work with some fancy machine learning there and actually categorized events and can actually delve deep into ransomware versus data breaches and much more characteristics around a various A4 style framework, and actually can provide estimates across many, many of these dimensions. If any of this sounds interesting to you there, we highly encourage you to reach out to us. You can do it the electronic email way, info@scientia.com. You can find us on the web, or if you'd just like to sit down and have a chat over a Zoom call there, we'll fire up a cup of coffee there. You can reach us at calendly.com/Scientia and schedule an introductory session today, and we'll be happy to chat with you on a no terms basis. Okay, that's been a whirlwind tour through Tsunami there. We've got a little bit of time left for a Q&A. Let us go to questions. If you have questions, please throw them in either the chat or the Q&A section. Happy to take them there.
Yeah, the absence of questions will be interpreted as us doing such a tremendous job that we covered literally every possible question you could have had.
We can talk about what's really a scary movie or not.
Right. I'm more of a Twilight Zone fan myself. I don't know about you. I'm less on the horror flicks, but you know,
I'm more
maybe
of
that's a different
classic
webinar.
scary movie person, but that's a whole separate topic. Well, it seems like we don't have any questions. Okay, a few more moments there for any final questions and answers, but I want to thank you all for attending on a Friday there for your time. Hope to catch you there. If you had a question and it didn't come up and you just couldn't put words to paper there, please go ahead and reach out to us, info@scientia.com. We're happy to have a conversation on any part of IRIS or any of our reports there. Always encouraged to engage with the audience. I see a question. Have you done any kind of retrospective analysis on how attacks have changed over time? Great question. Rachel, I'll name you there as having asked that question. We have not done that yet in the IRIS series. That is something we now have the capability of doing. Traditionally, we have focused on this 10-year time frame. What makes it a little bit complicated is that there is a lag time for events to show up. So if you came to me and asked, what are the top event patterns in 2021? I would tell you that that is going to be a very preliminary estimate based upon the data we have available. It generally takes anywhere from 6 to 12 months or longer for those events really to be populated in a data set. So I can tell you with much greater certainty what's happening in 2020, 2021, I'd say, here's a current estimate, and here's where we might be in 12 months of time there. So thank you for all the questions. Fantastic. Okay, well, I'm going to stop the webinar there. Thank you all for attending, and be safe out there.
Have a great day.